So, for good and for bad, the first trend, which I think is good, is that the United States empire is going down. Not because I'm anti-American, I've never been. I still find it an absolutely fascinating society with some of the most cultural dynamics and inventive technologies and everything. But the empire, I am anti-empire, whoever has this empire. Even if it was a Gandhian empire or a Mother Teresa empire, I would be against it. Because I believe in unity in diversity and not in unity in uniformity. So anybody who would try to monopolize a particular ideology would be, in my view, heading for war, violence, injustice, etc. The empire is going down, and some of the indicators are very easy to see. Deep economic crisis, diminishing legitimacy of what the United States empire does out there in the world. Fewer people take them serious, so to speak, which we did in the 60s and 70s. It is the dissolution of the American society from inside in terms of economic, socio-economic disparities, 15-20% living under the poverty line in the US. It is an enormous debt. It is a diminishing part of the global economy. If you compare the United States today with its percentage or its share of world trade, world investments, world exports, etc. in the 60s and today, you'll see it's becoming small. It's still the largest, or maybe the Chinese is bigger, it depends on how you measure. It's still a big economy, but it doesn't have the kind of enormous strength it had 30, 40 years ago. I think it's also fair to say that it's a self-militarizing and self-destructive system. There is this funny idea that the more military you use, the more wars you can fight, the more you spend on it, the more you are a great power. Fact is that all this is a huge burden on the civilian economy. And fact is that a major reason that we have a crisis in the Western world is the US empire. And it's, depending on how you measure it, 600 plus base facilities around the world in 130 plus countries. Fighting a number of wars at the same time, secret forces here and there, drone warfare and what have you, and nuclear weapons, which are tremendously expensive to develop. And so, you know, what used to be strength is being redefined. And those waiting in the wings think in a different way. So prediction is what happened to the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact will, in my view, happen. I don't put necessarily a number of years on it, but in a few years the same will happen to the West. That empire will dissolve, NATO will be dissolved, and I have a plan for NATO. I love NATO under one condition, that you take every single weapon away from NATO. Use the brilliant people, the brilliant technology, the large budgets and whatever to make it the world's largest and most important humanitarian organization that has the transport capacity, the communication capacity, etc., when a natural catastrophe happens. They're the ones who the UN would need, etc. And they're brilliant people, there's no doubt about it. They know technically what they're doing. It's just that they're doing it for the wrong purpose. And with the present Secretary General and the former Secretary General, things will only be worse. You see, Anders Fogh Rasmussen and I have a little good to say about. Stoltenberg used to be a decent man, a brilliant Prime Minister, and I happen to know his father quite well. And when I see him today, it kind of goes through his body language and his eyes and his bad English that he doesn't like the job he has. That's the good thing about the modern technology. We can now see people. We don't just have to read what they say. He feels awkward in that situation. So, I think these people would, at the top, be better served personally by changing that organization into something meaningful instead of destructive purposes only. When I was a young student, I interviewed people in NATO for my doctoral dissertation, and they all said, we are only here to make peace. They believed in that idea in a different way than I did, but I believe they were honest. They had seen, or their parents had seen, the Second World War. And they told me NATO is only here because there's the Soviet Union and a Warsaw Pact. Now, that's not historically quite true because NATO came first. But generally speaking, this is a type of organization the world cannot afford in the future. Economically, on taxpayers' money, everything they do is paid by you guys. And secondly, it's destructive. Fundamentally destructive in a world in which we need construction, not destruction. And that will eventually mean the dissolution of the US NATO empire. You cannot be that self-destructive decade after decade and have nothing to contribute positively to the world and survive. This is, almost an actual law. Now, my only concern is what will happen between now and the situation when the US NATO empire is gone. The West does not have a Gorbachev who could manage that dissolution process reasonably well without too much violence. We might be in, and that's one of the things I'm going to say and conclude, we might be in for some very difficult and very dangerous and very sad years the next 10 or 15 or so, but then everything will be better. Because then comes a multipolar world. That's my point too. A multipolar world, of course, will be structured around what we call the BRICS countries, which do not think in this way. The Chinese do not build bases in Africa. They build supermarkets, schools, and other things, and then they get what they want. They don't come with a Bible. I don't care whether people in Africa become Confucianists or with a sword. They don't fight wars for it. Neither does Russia anymore. Russia was an empire once with a heavy influence both in Africa and in the Middle East. It doesn't have it today, Russia. So the multipolar world will be more BRICS, and that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a few other countries in the future, one of them being my dear Iran. Because that is where the new dynamism is, across the world, and countries that do not have an impact through military, but through trade, common visions, and if you take, which probably not that many of you have heard about yet, the Silk Road project, which goes from Beijing all the way through Asia, all the way through the Middle East, all the way around Africa and over to the Southern American region, which will build culture, infrastructure, transport, trade, and all these kinds of things that the world needs. On a Chinese initiative, basically financed by the Chinese, but also by the countries that that project goes through. And again, Iran is one of the most important. As you may know, the Silk Road actually goes through, the old Silk Road goes through Iran too. And I'm mentioning Iran because I would like to touch upon Iran at some point because I work there at the moment, and I think it's an interesting country because it's different from anything else in the Middle East, and it's the most stable country at the moment. One of the problems we're up against, point 3, is that the world has a global economy, to a certain extent a global culture, and a global military. That means those who run these 3 things, military, economy, and culture, they think globally. They see the world as one unit, which is great, intellectually much better than the rest. But the political system still rests with nation states and governments. And that mishmash between the world as it is on these 3 scales and the local decision-making in each of the 193 members of the United Nations is not going to hold in the future. It is one reason that most of us are not very interested in party politics. I have not had a student the last 20 years who after one of my courses said, "Jan, do you think you could help me become a politician?" Whereas they all say, can you help me work with human rights or peace or women's issues or NGOs or the UN or something like that? But no one, not one of my thousands of students over the years has ever asked me, do you think I should become a politician? And that tells you something, that our democracy is in deep crisis because it's party-based, which is an old, outdated way of voting and thinking of issues. Political parties, in my view, should be phased out. And secondly, it's national-based. You can go and vote on who sits in Folketinget in Denmark, and how important is it? Honestly, what Folketinget decides of Denmark's total future is getting less and less. Whereas we ought to elect people who represent Denmark in international or other countries, in international forums. I would like to vote for the person who represents Denmark or Sweden, where I live, in NATO, in the UN, in the OECD. Wherever we go and have representatives, I would like ambassadors to be publicly elected. Why do we ask a Ministry of Foreign Affairs to do that behind the scenes? We don't even know. If I asked you who is the UN ambassador to your country, you probably don't know the name. I don't know the one at the moment. So we got to have a globalized democracy instead of what we see now, which is too localized, too parochial, too irrelevant to the big issues we have in front of us as humankind. And what is interesting in parentheses is that the political system of the United States is going through the beginnings of some kind of reform or revolution. The best candidate for the presidency is a person that you have never heard of. But she doesn't have the money behind her, and she doesn't have the media power. And her name is Jill Stein. Jill Stein is a doctor from Massachusetts. She's a head of the Green Party, and she's the one who would have a program that I personally would vote for any time as a president of the United States. But the ones you hear about are those who are paid by money. In the case of Trump, his own money, which is a good thing. He cannot be corrupted. He has them himself. And the others, particularly Hillary Clinton, who, God forbid, might become the president of the United States, and continue the interventionist policies of her husband, and continuing being pro-war. All the wars the US has fought, she's voted for them, and she was an architect of the destruction of Libya. So for those of you, I don't want to offend anybody, but for those of you who think that in principle it would be better to have a woman in the White House, my answer is yes, but not any woman. And if you look at what would be the best at the moment, as it looks at the moment for the rest of the world, I'm not familiar enough with the American system, but what would be best for the world would, in my view, be Sanders or Trump. And Trump, because he's not an interventionist. He's a businessman. He would not have any war with Russia, for instance, which, you know, we're itching towards a war with Russia. And he does not like particularly Saudi Arabia, and he's neutral when it comes to Israel. Now, these are three important things. And better even, if he becomes the presidential candidate of the Republican Party, that party will fall apart. Now, that would be great. If we finally could have a party in the United States, a new party, another party, a plurality of parties, instead of, when it comes to foreign policy, a one-party system with two fractions. The Democrats are worse in foreign politics than many others, than the Republicans. And some Republicans actually have done better job for the world, such as Ronald Reagan, whom I would have sworn would not do something good for the world. But he was almost disarming the world with nuclear weapons together with Gorbachev when they sat in Reykjavik, until some advisors came in and said, for God's sake, you cannot negotiate all the nuclear weapons away. Well, that's a good thing. Now, then he did the Star Wars and things like that, which was not so good. You know, it's a mixed bag. So, what we're in the middle of is a militarism that we haven't seen as strong as it is, and I call that the MIMAC, the Military Industrial Media Academic Complex. That's a long one, MIMAC, the Military Industrial Media Academic Complex. It's small vested interests in the military, in government circles, governments who go into board membership in the military enterprises. It's the academic world, where a horrendous amount of people are getting paid for developing new weapon systems, and the priesthood developing ideas of why we need, you know, nuclear deterrence and things like that. And the media. Most media today are pro-war. You just make a simple test. I mean, I talk about mainstream media. Western mainstream media and news bureaus. Just make a test. Has anybody in Denmark seen a Danish journalist ask a prime minister why we should go to war? And why the person thinks, Helle Thorning-Schmidt or whoever it is, or Løkke Rasmussen, that this war will be more successful than the other failures and predictable fiascos, as I call them. Whereas if I say we should speak with ISIS at some point, we should do something else, we should negotiate, we should dialogue, we should talk, we should understand the problem before we act. We should have more high-level intellectual discussions in Folketinget than we had last week when we decided to bomb Syria. I am getting that question from media. But Jan Øberg, do you really think that you're going to get anywhere with these people? These people, do they understand anything but weapons and being killed? Now, as long as you're media like that, which is just a personal experience, as long as you're media like that, as long as you have so much self-censorship in the media as there is in Danish media, much more than in Iranian press TV and Russia Today, where I work every week and comment on politics every week. I reach 650 million people in Russia Today because it's the third largest TV station after CNN and Al Jazeera. No word is cut out. Also when I criticize Putin and his bombings and his nuclear weapons and his military-industrial media academic complex. If I say these things in Danish media about Denmark, you can be sure that unfortunately something is cut out, or you're not invited to that program that you plan to be part of. It goes with Deadline, it goes with Debatten, it goes with other programs. I don't care, but don't tell me that we have freedom of expression in Denmark. What you have in other countries, I'm not familiar with, but I find it fascinating that it's so much easier to say critical things in Russia Today than it would be in Danish or Swedish media. The Swedish media never use me. I happen to know a little bit about the world, maybe too much for some of them. Then there is nuclearism, and it's very simple. Either we get rid of nuclear weapons or begin to disarm them, or they end our project. There is no way to coexist in the long run with nuclear weapons. And I find it interesting to see that that is an issue that is hardly discussed anywhere. It's a totally, the few of us who are working against nuclear weapons have no response anywhere from media, from a lot of peace movement people and others. It's a huge putting your head in the sand. You live in the nuclear age, and you can be gone this evening by human mistake or technical failure. I shall never forget that I was teaching in Austria a master's course some 10, 12 years ago, and I sat before the lunch break. To my students with a smile, I talked about nuclear deterrence and things like that and showed them some movies and why the ballistic missile defense is offensive and not defensive. And then I said, well, I hope to see you after lunch, but if not, it could be because there's a nuclear war in between. I went up to my room, opened my computer to see the news, and the first news was a French and a British submarine had collided in the Atlantic south of England. Two NATO countries had two huge submarines, they're not small friends, running into each other, damaging the British one so much that it had to be towed back to harbour in England. That story had been kept secret for 2.5 months until Daily Mail took it up, picked it up, and had done some research on it. You have no idea about how many nuclear accidents are happening that you don't hear about, or that you can only find in research reports or formally secret documents that are being released after some years. It's a dead, dangerous system we're living with, and NATO insists to be the first to use nuclear weapons, also against a conventional attack from a Russia that would not have, today at least, the capability to attack NATO, including Denmark. But nuclearism is something you've got to put on your agenda. Once upon a time, people would think that it was God who decided whether humanity should exist or not. Today, it's humans who can decide that project humankind, 7 billion people, should be eradicated. We have huge responsibilities, and you cannot do with a Christian neighborhood ethics. Don't kill your neighbor. Don't put your eyes on your neighbor's wife. Things like that. Totally irrelevant in a globalized world. We need a global ethics to talk about those who suffer from our policies far away, also if they are Muslims. And the fact that we have a moral responsibility we've never had before since July 16, 1945, when we blew off the first nuclear weapon in the Alamogordo Desert in the US, and afterwards were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We have a duty to see to it that humankind continues, which was never a moral problem before that date in 45. And then people say, well, since we have nuclear weapons and we have not had a nuclear war, obviously they protect us from war. My response is, that's exactly how a person thinks who has thrown himself out from the 40th floor in a skyscraper and passes the 12th floor and says, this goes well. There are more indications today, available on the net and in books, of how dangerous it is, even if nobody wants a nuclear war, to have them. And there are no political goals that will ever legitimate the existence or the use of nuclear weapons. So if Obama goes in June to Hiroshima, I hope he will do what John Kerry did not do, namely say, I am sorry. I am sorry. And I'll keep my promise from the Prague speech. And I'll move from Prague to Hiroshima, and I'll end my presidency with an initiative for nuclear abolition. I don't think he has the guts. And I'm also well aware that if he really said that and would start doing something concrete in that direction, he may very well be killed. Don't have any illusions. The forces behind these forces, the military, industrial, media, academic complex, are tough guys. There were a reason that most peace people who went up against them, such as Martin Luther King, Olof Palme, Gandhi, and others, were killed. It's not such a nice world. I don't want him to be killed, but maybe he could at least begin to make people think, instead of coming with this crook intellectual argument that there is something called just war, that he used in his Nobel Peace Award speech. He is, by the way, behind the US's largest nuclear rearmament program to $1 trillion. It's already decided that we shall have tons of more and more sophisticated nuclear weapons in the US and NATO. I won't go into it because it's not my specialty. Obviously, everybody in this room knows, and that's what we talk about because it hits ourselves, that's global warming. Environmental problems, etc. We are in the midst of the end. Either we solve that or we will have our children will have a hell. I'm not an expert on it, but you know what I'm talking about. And there we need ethics again. We need not human rights. We need human duties. And we need to recognize that rights do not pertain only to human beings, but to nature, to organisms, to trees, to all the small things that we need to survive ourselves. So the only problem I have with the concept of human rights is the word human and the word right. Instead of rights, we have duties. As Gandhi said, there are no rights without duties. I'd like an international charter of duties, where the Earth Charter, go and study that, is the best written so far. And the other thing is that other creatures but human beings have rights. This anthropocentric idea that only human beings have rights and rights to destroy other living creatures is a fundamentally sick idea. Buddhists know better. Holists know better. Environmentalists know better. Next, and this is a little bit more complex because it draws together a few things. The European Union is on its way down too. Sorry for all these down, down, down movements, but things will come up. Because crisis will, according to any dialectics, release new thinking and innovation. The reason is the following. We have bombed the hell out of the Middle East, and now comes the boomeranging effects. Economic crisis, hatred, refugees, terrorism. I'd like to quote the Danish Prime Minister when he was pressed after the so-called terrorist attacks in Copenhagen last year, in a panel discussion in the TV at Christian Sport. And we was pressed, why do you think people do this against Denmark? We're such nice guys. And he said, well, I don't know really. We shouldn't talk about it because, you know, when we talk about why terrorists do what they do, we begin to legitimate what they do. No. Why do you think they do it? Well, you know, it's a kind of religious wars, he then said. And then he added what I call a perfect racist statement, and he's not aware of it himself. He said, but the new thing is that the wars now take place on European territory. The new thing is that the wars now take place in the European territory and not in the Middle East far away from us. So why is it going down? Because by the deal it has done with Turkey and the lack of ability to receive the completely ridiculously few refugees coming into Europe, 0.2% of the population of the EU, we have violated the Schengen Convention, they have violated the Dublin Convention, they have abolished the asylum right and other refugee laws, including Sweden. And I have to show my passport as a Danish citizen to get into the Sweden I've lived in for 44 years when I come to Hyllie on the other side, or I cannot present my old passport or driving license at Kastrup Airport. I will not get to Sweden. Now that is to abolish the asylum law, the asylum-seeking right, which is a human right for people in need of protection. If you do that and you violate your own law, and you'd make an absolutely dirty human trade deal with Turkey of all countries, pay them 6 billion euros to take care of this problem, you will go down. Because you don't even respect your own laws. And you have shown that you have no humanism. European peoples have humanity and compassion and help a lot of refugees when they've come in. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about politicians. The only politician in Europe who has shown a decent response to the refugees coming in is Madame Merkel. And she's paying a high price for that. Think of Pegida. Think of the new Deutsche Alternative, third largest party in today's Germany, whose chief, a woman, argues that German police should be allowed to shoot refugees at the border. Something is happening in Europe, dear friends, that is not so good. And some of us who are old enough to remember things, I'm not saying the First or the Second World War, I was not born there, but we are remembering, what we talked about at that time, us beginning to see patterns that we've seen before in Europe, all caused by one single thing: the ongoing bombing and destruction of one country after the other in the Middle East. The refugees come from the countries that we have destroyed, basically. With a few exceptions. I know there are bad guys among them too, but the majority of these people are people in need of protection because we destroyed their countries. Now, a union that cannot pull its act together, cannot work out a policy, cannot set off the money for it, cannot share the burden of these refugees, is a lousy construction with no morals, no economic planning, and being taken by surprise that at sometime refugees would begin to stream into Europe as a consequence of our bombings and making life uninhabitable in their own countries. I mean, where are we? What world do these people live in? And what does Denmark do? What does France and Britain do? They say more bombings. Good luck. And let's see what happens to the Danes who will be killed in the future in terrorist attacks in Denmark, on Denmark. I wonder how far we shall go before people open their eyes and their hearts and see how complicit we are historically in what goes on in the Middle East. Since Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, since the destruction in 1911 of Libya by France, Britain, and Italy, since the Balfour Declaration, the establishment of Israel, that was okay for me, but not the Israel we have today. And how little we have in reality done for one of the most subdued, harassed people on earth, the Palestinians. Now, all these things are not signs of strength, friends. These are signs of weaknesses and decay, moral decay and otherwise, and it's all indicators of a West slowly but surely going down. Whether with a whimper or a bang. That's what I don't know and nobody knows. We have no Gorbachev in the West. So we are running into something of a cultural war situation, not because religion and cultures produce war, but because they are used. When economy, politics, and everything else falls apart, exactly as in old Yugoslavia, these Conflicts are not ethnic in the bottom. They are not religious in the bottom. But ethnicity, religion, and culture can be used as tools to fight with when other things such as economy, constitution, etc. has fallen apart. And that's what I learned from many years of working in Yugoslavia and partly being educated there. All Serbs do not hate Croats, and all Croats do not hate Serbs, and all Serbs do not hate Muslims, etc., etc., etc. But you can make people hate when everything is falling apart around you and you have only these kind of atavistic old things and traumas from Second World War that you can press. That is what is coming back to Europe now. Therefore, a non-interventionist foreign policy, an alternative Danish foreign policy with peace by peaceful means, dialogue, humanitarian aid, talks, analysis, mediation. There are tons of things we could do instead if we had not been to brain Washington, like Mr. Fogh Rasmussen was, and the present Secretary General of NATO was. Nobody becomes a Secretary General of NATO before you've been 4 months in Washington and been brainwashed. No, it's true. I know it. It's true. They disappear for 4 months and then they turn up in Brussels and say, I'm the new Secretary General. And they speak like they've gone through a total change. Stoltenberg never sounded like this before.